Number 1. Erich Mielke, the Master of Fear. Erich Mielke wasn't just East Germany's spy master. He was the architect of what historians call the most pervasive surveillance state ever created on German soil. And his system was so efficient, it knew your secrets before you did. Born in 1907 into working-class Berlin, young Mielke witnessed the chaos of post-World War I Germany, where political violence consumed the streets. By age 24, he'd already murdered 2 police captains in broad daylight. When a witness survived, Mielke fled to Stalin's Soviet Union, where he'd learned that killing cops was just the beginning. In Russia, he worked alongside the NKVD during the Great Purge, mastering surveillance and elimination tactics that killed hundreds of thousands. He hunted dissidents in Spain's civil war, targeting fellow leftists who strayed from Stalin's orthodoxy. By the time he returned to Germany, he'd become a doctor of terror with a PhD in paranoia. In 1957, Mielke seized control of the Stasi. What he built over 32 years defied comprehension: 91,000 full-time officers and 170,000 informants, watching just 17 million citizens. That's one spy for every 66 people: your neighbor, your co-worker, your spouse. But Mielke's true genius was Zersetzung, psychological decomposition. Instead of arresting dissidents, the Stasi destroyed their lives invisibly. Jobs vanished, marriages collapsed, strange events plagued their homes. The goal wasn't imprisonment, it was madness. His agents intercepted every letter, tapped every phone, bugged every room. They maintained files on 6 million people, documenting sexual habits, friendship networks, private fears. Mielke personally authorized shoot-to-kill orders at the Berlin Wall, transforming the border into an execution ground. The Master of Fear controlled everything, but he wasn't alone in perfecting the art of invisible terror. Number 2. Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo's ghost. Heinrich Müller was the invisible architect of Nazi Germany's most feared organization. And unlike other Nazi leaders, he vanished without a trace, possibly escaping justice entirely. Born in 1900 in Munich, Müller wasn't a fanatical early Nazi. He was something more dangerous: a cold bureaucrat who treated mass murder as simply another administrative task. His efficiency caught the attention of Heydrich and Himmler, who placed him in command of Department 4 of the Reich Security Main Office in 1939. That department was the Gestapo. Under Müller's leadership, the Gestapo became what historians call the central executive organ of National Socialist terror. He systematically destroyed every resistance network in Germany: communists, social democrats, church opposition groups. But destruction wasn't enough. Müller infiltrated them first, turned members into informants, then used those informants to trap others in an ever-widening web of betrayal. His signature achievement was coordinating the Holocaust's logistics. The Gestapo organized deportations of millions to ghettos and death camps. Müller attended the Wannsee Conference, where 15 bureaucrats formalized the final solution over lunch. He turned genocide into a railway schedule. His interrogation chambers pioneered calculated brutality. Suspects tortured until they confessed or implicated others, creating an endless chain of arrests. He wielded Schutzhaft, protective custody, which meant indefinite concentration camp detention without trial or charges. His informant networks forced Germans to spy on neighbors, colleagues, family members. Fear became Germany's second government. Then came May 1945. As Berlin fell, Müller simply disappeared. His body was never identified. The man who helped murder millions became one of history's most wanted ghosts, possibly escaping to South America, or, in the ultimate irony, defecting to the Soviet Union. But while Müller vanished into legend, his superior had already met a very different fate. Number 3. Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague. Reinhard Heydrich was the man even other Nazis feared. Hitler himself called him the man with the iron heart. And what lived inside that heart was pure, calculated evil. Born in 1904 into a cultured musical family, Heydrich seemed destined for the arts. Instead, he became one of history's most efficient killers. Tall, blonde, athletic, the physical embodiment of Nazi racial ideology. He rose through SS ranks with terrifying speed, catching Himmler's eye with his organizational brilliance and complete absence of mercy. By 1941, Heydrich controlled the RSHA, unifying the Gestapo, criminal police, and security service under one command. This gave him more power than any secret policeman in German history. On January 20th, 1942, Heydrich chaired a meeting at a villa on Berlin's Wannsee Lake. In 90 minutes, 15 bureaucrats formalized the final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jewry. Heydrich presented genocide with the clinical detachment of a corporate presentation, but his masterpiece was the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads following the Wehrmacht into Soviet territory. These units executed entire communities in fields and ravines. Over 2 million people, including approximately 1.3 million Jews, murdered in an industrial campaign of slaughter. The Einsatzgruppen pioneered the assembly line killing that inspired the gas chambers. As Deputy Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, Heydrich earned the title Butcher of Prague. Mass arrests, show trials, public executions became daily routine. Terror was his native language, and he spoke it fluently. Then came May 27, 1942. Czech resistance fighters ambushed his open car in Prague. A grenade exploded, sending fragments deep into his body. He died days later from infection. Hitler's response was apocalyptic. Entire villages erased, their populations massacred. Yet Heydrich's death proved even the most powerful monsters were mortal. But his methods lived on in a man who took Soviet terror to unimaginable extremes. Number 4. Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's monster. Lavrentiy Beria was a man of such comprehensive evil that even hardened Soviet officials recoiled in horror. And the worst part? Stalin trusted him completely. Born in 1899 in Georgia, Beria joined the Bolsheviks during Russia's Civil War and quickly distinguished himself through absolute loyalty to Stalin and complete absence of moral constraints. By 1938, he'd become head of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, taking over during the tail end of the Great Purge. But Beria didn't end the purges. He perfected them. Under his command, the NKVD orchestrated the Katyn massacre. 22,000 Polish officers and intellectuals executed in 1940 and buried in mass graves. Stalin wanted Poland's leadership class eliminated. Beria made it happen with industrial efficiency. He organized ethnic deportations on a scale that defied comprehension. Entire populations, Chechens, English, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, hundreds of thousands of people loaded into cattle cars and shipped to Central Asia. Thousands died in transit. Thousands more died of exposure and starvation in exile. The survivors lost their homes, their culture, their identity. Beria expanded the Gulag system into a vast empire of forced labor. Millions of prisoners built canals, railroads, and factories under conditions designed to kill. The Soviet economy ran on slave labor, and Beria was the master overseer. But beyond his political crimes, Beria was personally sadistic in ways that shocked even the NKVD. Witnesses later testified to torture sessions he personally supervised and to sexual violence against women and girls that made him a predator as well as a mass murderer. When Stalin died in 1953, Beria made a bid for power. It was his fatal mistake. Other Soviet leaders arrested him in June, and after a secret trial, he was executed in December. Some said he begged for his life at the end. Others claimed he died defiant. Either way, the monster was finally dead. But Beria hadn't been the first or the worst of Stalin's executioners. Before him came a man whose name became synonymous with terror itself. Number 5. Nikolai Yezhov, the Bloody Dwarf. Nikolai Yezhov was a small man who cast an enormous shadow of death. In just 16 months, he oversaw more arrests than most secret police chiefs manage in decades. And his reward for loyalty? Stalin had him killed too. Born in 1895, Yezhov stood barely 5 feet tall, but what he lacked in physical stature, he compensated for with bottomless brutality. By 1936, Stalin placed him command of the NKVD, and the Great Purge, the Yezhovshchina, began in earnest. The numbers defy comprehension. 1.5 million arrests in 16 months, 681,000 executions, entire categories of people marked for elimination, former party members, ethnic minorities, intellectuals, military officers, random citizens caught in quota systems that demanded arrest regardless of guilt. Yezhov imposed arrest quotas on regional NKVD offices. If you were a local commander told to arrest 1,000 enemies, you arrested 1,000 people, guilty or not. Torture became standardized procedure. Confessions were beaten out of prisoners, who were then forced to name accomplices, creating an endless chain of arrests. The Polish operation alone killed over 100,000 people. Poles living in the Soviet Union targeted simply for their ethnicity. Yezhov's NKVD didn't just persecute political enemies, It committed ethnic cleansing on a massive scale. His methods were crude but terrifyingly effective. Troikas, three-man courts, sentenced thousands to death in minutes. Prisoners were shot immediately after conviction, their bodies dumped in mass graves. The NKVD became an execution factory running 24 hours a day. Then Stalin decided Yezhov had outlived his usefulness. In 1938, he was removed from power. In 1939, he was arrested. In 1940, he was shot. Soviet propaganda literally airbrushed him out of photographs, the vanishing commissar, erased from history as if he'd never existed. But before Yezhov, before Beria, there was the original architect of Soviet terror, the man who invented the system they all used. Number 6. Felix Dzerzhinsky. Iron Felix. Felix Dzerzhinsky was the founding father of Soviet terror, and everything that came after, the purges, the gulags, the disappearances, he invented the template. Born in 1877 into Polish nobility, Dzerzhinsky became a revolutionary at age 15, repeatedly imprisoned under the Tsarist regime. By the time Lenin seized power in October 1917, Dzerzhinsky had spent 11 years in prisons and exile. Those years had hardened him into something cold, merciless, and utterly convinced of his righteousness. In December 1917, Lenin appointed him head of the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission to combat counter-revolution and sabotage, the Cheka. It was the world's first communist secret police, and Dzerzhinsky built it with fanatical zeal. The Cheka unleashed the Red Terror during Russia's Civil War. Summary executions without trial became official policy. Estimates suggest 50,000 to 200,000 people were shot during the terror's peak years. Class origin became a death sentence. If you were born a noble, a priest, or a merchant, you could be executed simply for existing. Dzerzhinsky pioneered concentration camps for class enemies. These proto-gulags held tens of thousands in brutal conditions, forced into slave labor, or left to die of disease and starvation. The camps would later expand into the massive gulag system that imprisoned millions. The Cheka took hostages from suspect populations, holding them to ensure compliance. It infiltrated opposition groups, creating elaborate provocations to trap enemies. Dzerzhinsky transformed secret police work from investigation into industrial-scale political murder. He remained in power until his death in 1926, dying of a heart attack after a passionate speech defending Stalin's policies. The Soviet Union honored him as a hero, erecting statues and naming cities after him. They called him Iron Felix, a man of steel will and zero mercy. Yet even Dzerzhinsky's brutal legacy would be refined by later Soviet chiefs. One in particular turned secret police work into a science. Number 7. Yuri Andropov, the Butcher of Budapest. Yuri Andropov was different from the secret police chiefs who came before him. He didn't just kill dissidents, he destroyed them psychologically, turning Soviet repression into an art form of invisible cruelty. Born in 1914, Andropov rose through Communist Party ranks with a reputation for intelligence and ruthless efficiency. In 1956, as Soviet ambassador to Hungary, he faced his first major test when Hungarians revolted against communist rule. Andropov convinced Khrushchev to crush the uprising with tanks and troops. Thousands died. Hundreds were executed. The bloodbath earned him a nickname that would haunt him forever, the Butcher of Budapest. In 1967, he became chairman of the KGB, a position he'd hold for 15 years. Under his leadership, the KGB evolved from a blunt instrument into a sophisticated machine of psychological warfare. Andropov viewed dissidents not as criminals, but as mental patients, enemies of the state who must be sick to oppose Soviet perfection. He created the Fifth Directorate specifically to monitor and suppress ideological opposition, writers, religious believers, human rights activists, national minorities. But instead of creating martyrs through arrests and trials, Andropov perfected psychiatric repression. Sane dissidents were declared mentally ill and confined to psychiatric hospital. There they were forcibly drugged with antipsychotics that caused permanent brain damage, muscle spasms, and chemical lobotomies. Doctors became torturers, hospitals became prisons, medicine became a weapon. The KGB also employed sophisticated harassment techniques. Dissidents lost their jobs through anonymous complaints. Their apartments were broken into with nothing stolen, just subtle signs that someone had been there. Friends mysteriously cut off contact. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere, anytime, and you'll never see us coming. Andropov's system was so effective that it suppressed an entire generation of Soviet dissent without creating the international outcry that mass arrest would have triggered. In 1982, he became General Secretary of the Soviet Union, the only KGB chief ever to rule the entire country. But Soviet secret police, for all their brutality, weren't the only masters of terror. In Latin America, another man would build a system that shocked even hardened intelligence professionals. Number 8. Heinrich Jagoda, the canal builder. Before Beria and Yezhov, there was Heinrich Jagoda, the man who transformed the Gulag into an empire of death. And his greatest crime wasn't just killing people, it was working them to death while pretending it was progress. Born in 1891, Jagoda joined the Bolsheviks and rose through secret police ranks until 1934, when he became head of the unified NKVD. He took over during Stalin's consolidation of power, and what Stalin needed was someone who could eliminate political enemies while building Soviet infrastructure. Jagoda delivered both. His signature project was the White Sea-Baltic Canal, a 227-kilometer waterway connecting the White Sea to Lake Onega. It was hailed as a triumph of Soviet engineering. The truth was far darker. The canal was built almost entirely by Gulag prisoners, working with hand tools in sub-zero temperatures. No machinery, no safety equipment, just forced labor and quotas that demanded the impossible. Conservative estimates suggest 170,000 prisoners worked on the canal. At least 25,000 died during construction, possibly tens of thousands more. They died of exhaustion, exposure, starvation, accidents, and execution for failing to meet quotas. Jagoda knew the conditions were lethal. He didn't care. The canal had to be finished, and prisoners were disposable. Under his command, the Gulag system expanded dramatically. Hundreds of camps across the Soviet Union held millions of prisoners, all providing free labor for Stalin's industrialization. The Soviet economy was built on slavery, and Jagoda was chief overseer of the slaves. He also supervised early show trials, including the 1936 prosecution of Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, old Bolsheviks forced to confess to fabricated crimes before being shot. The trials established a template for Stalinist justice: confess, implicate others, die. In 1936, Stalin removed Jagoda from power, suspecting him of insufficient zeal. At the 1938 trial of the 21, Jagoda himself became a defendant, accused of treason and conspiracy. He was convicted and executed. The man who sent millions to the Gulag died by the same system he'd built. But Jagoda's successor wouldn't just imprison enemies. He'd hunt them with an organization that redefined counterintelligence. Number 9. Viktor Abakumov, the Smersh commander. Viktor Abakumov commanded an organization with one of history's most chilling names, Smersh, death to spies. And he took that mandate literally. Born in 1908, Abakumov rose through Soviet security organs through a combination of competence and cruelty. In 1943, Stalin created Smersh as a specialized counterintelligence force, and Abakumov became its chief. His mission: eliminate spies, traitors, and defeatists within Soviet ranks during World War II. Smersh operated with terrifying efficiency. It set up checkpoints behind Soviet lines, screening soldiers returning from German captivity. If you'd been captured, you were suspect. If you'd survived German camps, you must be a traitor. Hundreds of thousands of returning prisoners of war were interrogated, tortured, and sent to Gulag camps, punished for the crime of surviving. Smersh also conducted executions behind the front lines, shooting soldiers accused of cowardice or defeatism to maintain discipline through terror. Commissars had the authority to execute anyone, anytime, for any reason. Abakumov perfected this into a system. After the war in 1946, Abakumov became Minister of State Security, head of the MGB, effectively controlling the Soviet secret police. He created a special board with power to arrest, judge, and execute without normal court procedures. Justice became whatever Abakumov declared it to be. He orchestrated the Leningrad affair, a purge of party leaders that resulted in thousands of arrests and hundreds of executions. Senior officials were shot. Their families were exiled. Stalin suspected Leningrad of developing independent power, and Abakumov eliminated the entire leadership structure. Abakumov also participated in the climate of anti-Jewish paranoia that led to the Doctor's Plot, accusations that Jewish physicians were conspiring to kill Soviet leaders. Torture extracted confessions. Only Stalin's death in 1953 prevented mass executions, but Stalin's death doomed Abakumov too. New Soviet leaders arrested him for criminal interrogation methods, the torture he'd used on thousands. In 1954, he was executed. The hunter became the hunted. Yet Soviet terror wasn't the only model. In South America, a different kind of secret police chief would emerge, one trained by the CIA and funded by the United States. Number 10. Manuel Contreras, Pinochet's enforcer. Manuel Contreras built what U.S. intelligence documents would later describe as a Gestapo-type organization in Chile, and he did it with American support. Born in 1929, Contreras was a Chilean army officer who became General Augusto Pinochet's most trusted enforcer after the September 1973 military coup that overthrew elected President Salvador Allende. Within months, Contreras founded DINA, Dirección de Inteligencia Nacional, Chile's new secret police. DINA established a network of clandestine torture centers across Chile. Villa Grimaldi in Santiago became the most infamous, a former mansion transformed into a chamber of horrors. Approximately 4,500 people passed through Villa Grimaldi. At least 226 never left alive. Contreras's interrogators employed systematic torture, electric shocks applied to sensitive areas, beatings with fists and clubs, near drowning, sexual violence, suspension from ceilings, forced witnessing of others' torture. The goal wasn't just information, it was total psychological destruction. But Contreras's ambitions extended beyond Chile's borders. He became chief architect of Operation Condor, a multinational campaign by South American dictatorships to hunt down and eliminate leftist exiles across continents. Chilean agents assassinated targets in Argentina, Italy, Washington, D.C., and beyond. The most notorious Operation Condor assassination occurred in September 1976, when a car bomb exploded in Washington, killing former Chilean diplomat Orlando Letelier and his American colleague Ronnie Moffat. The Chilean secret police had conducted a terrorist attack in the United States Capitol. Declassified U.S. documents later revealed the CIA knew about DINA's operations and maintained contact with Contreras throughout the dictatorship. The United States had helped train and fund the organization, terrorizing Chilean citizens. An official Chilean commission eventually estimated over 40,000 people were imprisoned, tortured, or killed during Pinochet's dictatorship. Contreras was convicted in multiple cases and sentenced to more than 500 years in prison. He died in a military hospital in 2015, never showing remorse. But Contreras had a deputy whose personal cruelty exceeded even his commanders. Number 11. Marcelo Morén Brito, the death caravan commander. If Manuel Contreras was the architect of Chilean terror, Marcelo Morén Brito was the hands-on executioner, and his specialty was making death personal. Born in 1935, Morén Brito rose to colonel in the Chilean army and became DINA's chief of operations, Contreras' right-hand man for the regime's cruelest actions. His first major operation set the tone for everything that followed. In October 1973, just weeks after the coup, General Sergio Arellano Stark led a helicopter mission to northern Chile with Morén Brito as his operational commander. They called it the Caravan of Death. The mission? Execute political prisoners already in military custody. The caravan visited multiple cities, selecting prisoners at random. Among the victims was Victor Jara, the beloved folk singer whose hands were broken before he was machine-gunned to death. At least 75 people were executed during the caravan's tour. Their families weren't informed. The bodies were hidden or destroyed. But Morén Brito's most enduring legacy was Villa Grimaldi. As commander of Chile's most notorious torture center, he oversaw interrogation sessions that broke international humanitarian law daily. The perilla, a metal bed frame, became Villa Grimaldi's signature instrument. Prisoners were strapped down and electrocuted repeatedly until they confessed or died. Interrogators employed water torture, suspension, sexual violence, and psychological torment. One technique involved forcing prisoners to watch others being tortured, knowing they'd be next but not knowing when. The waiting sometimes broke people faster than physical pain. Of the 4,500 people who passed through Villa Grimaldi under Morén Brito's command, at least 226 were killed or disappeared, murdered and their bodies disposed of secretly so families would never have closure. After democracy returned to Chile, Morén Brito was convicted in numerous human rights trials. He received more than 300 years in prison for crimes against humanity. He died in custody in 2015, joining Contreras in death as he joined him in atrocity. Chile's terror was extensive but geographically limited. In Cambodia, another man would create a killing machine of such efficiency, it shocked the world. Number 12. Kang Kek Iew, Comrade Duch, the S-21 commander. Kang Kek Yew, known as Comrade Duch, ran arguably the most lethal prison of the 20th century. And the horrifying part? He was a former mathematics teacher. Born in 1942, Duch joined Cambodia's communist movement and rose through Khmer Rouge ranks to head Santebel, internal security. When the Khmer Rouge captured Phnom Penh in April 1975, Duch was appointed director of tool slaying, designated S-21, a former high school transformed into an extermination center. The numbers from S-21 are almost incomprehensible. Approximately 12,000 to 14,000 people entered. Fewer than a dozen survived. That's a mortality rate of 99.9%, higher than most Nazi death camps. S-21 wasn't designed for detention. It was designed for confession extraction, followed by execution. Prisoners, many of them Khmer Rouge members accused of betraying the revolution, were tortured until they confessed to elaborate conspiracies that never existed. Then they were trucked to the Chuang killing fields and murdered. Duch's interrogators used systematic torture, beatings, electric shocks, water torture, suspension, starvation, and medical experiments. But the psychological torture might have been worse. Prisoners were forced to write detailed autobiographies confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, implicating family and friends. Duch personally reviewed every confession, sending them back if they weren't detailed enough. Documents recovered from S-21 include Duch's handwritten notes on prisoner lists. Next to names, he wrote phrases like, "smash them to pieces," and "kill them all." These weren't metaphors. They were execution orders written with bureaucratic precision. The Khmer Rouge regime collapsed in 1979 when Vietnam invaded Cambodia. Duch went into hiding, living under aliases for nearly 2 decades. He was finally arrested in 1999, discovered working at a refugee camp. In 2010, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia convicted him of crimes against humanity, murder, and torture. His sentence was increased to life imprisonment. The mathematics teacher who calculated death remained imprisoned until his death in 2020. But while Duch operated in Cambodia's isolation, another secret police chief ran an organization that reached across the Middle East. Number 13. Nematollah Nassiri, the Shah's Iron Fist. Nematollah Nassiri commanded SAVAK, the Iranian secret police that made the Shah's regime one of the most feared in the Middle East. And when the revolution came, the people's rage focused directly on him. Born in 1910, Nassiri was a career military officer who became commander of the Imperial Guard, developing a close personal relationship with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1965, the Shah appointed him director of SAVAK, the intelligence and security organization that would become synonymous with repression. Nassiri also served as deputy prime minister, giving him unprecedented power over Iranian society. Under his leadership, SAVAK evolved into a comprehensive surveillance state. Informants infiltrated universities, mosques, labor unions, and neighborhoods. Political opposition became virtually impossible. Speaking against the Shah could mean arrest, torture, and imprisonment. Human rights organizations documented SAVAK's torture methods during Nassiri's tenure. Beatings, electric shocks, forced standing for days, psychological torment, sexual violence. Evin Prison in Tehran became infamous as the center of SAVAK's operations, a place where screams echoed through corridors and prisoners emerged broken or never emerged at all. SAVAK tracked Iranian dissidents abroad, conducting surveillance and occasionally assassination operations beyond Iran's borders. The organization's reach seemed limitless, creating a climate of paranoia among expatriate Iranians. The system worked until it didn't. In 1978, popular protests exploded across Iran. The Shah dismissed Nassiri, replacing him in a desperate attempt to appease protesters. It was too late. When Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution succeeded in January 1979, Nassiri was arrested. The new regime tried him before a revolutionary tribunal, proceedings that themselves lacked due process, but reflected popular rage at SAVAK's abuses. He was convicted of corruption on earth, torture, and treason. On February 16, 1979, Nassiri faced a firing squad. The man who'd commanded Iran's machinery of fear died by the same revolutionary violence he'd helped provoke. SAVAK's methods spread across the Middle East. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein built an even more brutal system, and his most feared enforcers came from his own family. Number 14. Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti, Saddam's intelligence chief. Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti had a unique qualification for running Iraq's intelligence service. He was Saddam Hussein's half-brother, and that family connection made him one of the most feared men in Iraq. Born in 1951 in Tikrit, Barzan grew up in the same clan that produced Saddam. When Saddam seized power, he placed family members in key security positions, trusting blood more than ideology or competence. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Barzan headed the Mukhabarat, Iraqi intelligence service, combining foreign espionage with domestic secret police functions. Under his command, the Mukhabarat orchestrated assassinations of Iraqi dissidents abroad and executions of suspected traitors at home. Barzan personally supervised the purging of military officers Saddam deemed insufficiently loyal. Officers were arrested, interrogated under torture, and shot, sometimes with their entire families. Witnesses who later testified before the Iraqi Special Tribunal described Barzan's personal involvement in torture. He reportedly supervised electric shock torture sessions personally, beating prisoners with cables while they hung naked from ceilings. One witness testified that Barzan used threats of a meat grinder for human flesh, a horrific device allegedly used to execute victims by feeding them into industrial machinery. The Mukhabarat under Barzan was instrumental in the Dujail massacre. After an assassination attempt on Saddam's motorcade in the town of Dujail in 1982, Barzan's agents rounded up 148 people, including children. All were tortured. All were executed. The entire town was punished through collective punishment. Homes destroyed, farms confiscated, families displaced. When Saddam's regime fell in 2003, Barzan went into hiding. He was captured in 2003 and tried alongside Saddam for crimes against humanity in the Dujail case. He was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 15, 2007, Barzan was hanged. The execution was botched. The drop decapitated him, creating a grotesque end for a man who'd caused so much suffering. But Barzan wasn't Saddam's only family enforcer. His cousin would become even more notorious. Number 15. Ali Hassan al-Majid, Chemical Ali, the architect of genocide. Ali Hassan al-Majid earned a nickname that captured his crimes perfectly, Chemical Ali, and he earned it by gassing entire villages with weapons that the world had banned. Born around 1941 in Tikrit, al-Majid was Saddam Hussein's cousin and one of his most trusted enforcers. He rose through Ba'ath Party ranks through a combination of family connection and demonstrated ruthlessness. Saddam gave him positions of increasing power, including Director of General Security, Iraq's internal secret police, and Secretary of the Northern Bureau, making him effectively governor of Kurdish regions. In 1987, Saddam ordered al-Majid to solve the Kurdish problem. What followed was genocide. The Al-Anfal campaign, named after a Quranic chapter, targeted Iraqi Kurds with systematic extermination. Villages were surrounded by Iraqi forces. Men were separated from women and children. The men were never seen again. Human Rights Watch estimates approximately 100,000 Kurds were murdered or disappeared during Al-Anfal. Entire villages were bulldozed. Survivors were forcibly relocated. But al-Majid's signature tactic was chemical weapons. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi forces attacked the Kurdish town of Halabja with chemical weapons, a mix of mustard gas and nerve agents. 5,000 civilians died in hours. Victims suffocated, convulsed, and died in their homes and streets. Photographs of dead families clutching each other became images that shocked the world. Audio recordings later recovered captured al-Majid's voice boasting about the attacks. He dismissed international criticism and joked about gassing villages. To him, it was simply an efficient solution to a political problem. Al-Majid also commanded brutal suppression of Shia uprisings in southern Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War. Thousands were executed. Mass graves held bodies of men, women, and children shot and buried in the desert. When American forces invaded Iraq in 2003, al-Majid was captured. The Iraqi High Tribunal tried him multiple times for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He received 4 separate death sentences, one for each major atrocity he'd committed. On January 25, 2010, Chemical Ali was hanged. The man who'd poisoned thousands with gas died by a rope around his neck. From Dzerzhinsky's founding of Soviet secret police to Chemical Ali's genocide, these men didn't just enforce laws, they rewrote the boundaries of institutional cruelty. They transformed surveillance into suffocation, interrogation into torture, and justice into murder. Some died in luxury, their crimes unpunished. Others faced firing squads, gallows, or their own systems of terror turned against them. But all of them left legacies written in blood that still stain history. The techniques they pioneered, mass surveillance, psychological warfare, ethnic cleansing, forced disappearances, didn't die with them. Modern surveillance states still study their methods. Dictators still use their playbooks. The machinery of institutional terror they built continues operating in modified forms across the globe. These weren't monsters from mythology. They were human beings who chose to wield power without mercy, who transformed bureaucracies into killing machines, who convinced themselves that any atrocity was justified by ideology or national security. Their stories serve as warnings. Warning about the dangers of unchecked state power. Warning about what happens when surveillance replaces privacy. Warning about how ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary evil. Because the most terrifying truth about these 15 men isn't that they were uniquely evil, it's that they were human, and humans built the systems that enabled them. Remember their crimes, remember their victims, and never forget how easily institutions designed to protect can become instruments of terror. 15 men, 15 systems of terror, millions of victims. From Dzerzhinsky's founding of Soviet secret police to Chemical Ali's genocide, these men didn't just enforce laws, they rewrote the boundaries of institutional cruelty. They transformed surveillance into suffocation, interrogation into torture, and justice into murder. Some died in luxury, their crimes unpunished. Others faced firing squads, gallows, or their own systems of terror turned against them. But all of them left legacies written in blood that still stain history. The techniques they pioneered, mass surveillance, psychological warfare, ethnic cleansing, forced disappearances, didn't die with them. Modern surveillance states still study their methods. Dictators still use their playbooks. The machinery of institutional terror they built continues operating in modified forms across the globe. These weren't monsters from mythology. They were human beings who chose to wield power without mercy, who transformed bureaucracies into killing machines, who convinced themselves that any atrocity was justified by ideology or national security. Their stories serve as warnings. Warning about the dangers of unchecked state power. Warning about what happens when surveillance replaces privacy. Warning about how ordinary people can become instruments of extraordinary evil. Because the most terrifying truth about these 15 men isn't that they were uniquely evil. It's that they were human, and humans built the systems that enabled them. Remember their crimes, remember their victims, and never forget how easily institutions designed to protect can become instruments of terror.